The snow was falling in wide, heavy flakes, muting the neighborhood into a white silence. Porch lights glowed like candles in glass jars, and every window I passed on Maple Grove Lane seemed to shine with warmth. Families sat around tables sharing food, laughter, and stories. It was Thanksgiving, supposed to be a day of gratitude. When I turned into my daughter's driveway, I expected more of the same warmth voices, the smell of roasted turkey. Instead, I saw a shape on the steps. At first, I thought it was a forgotten decoration, some bundle of fabric half buried in snow. But then it shifted, shivering against the cold. My heart sank. It was Amos. My grandson sat hunched on the concrete porch, arms wrapped tight around his knees. No jacket, no gloves, no hat, only a thin t-shirt and jeans already stiff with ice. His lips were purple, his cheeks raw with frostbite's early sting. Snow clung to his hair, melting in little rivulets down his neck. I slammed my truck into park and threw open the door. The cold bit my skin, but nothing compared to what that boy had endured. Amos. My voice broke against the wind. What in God's name are you doing out here? He lifted his head, and the look in his eyes nearly broke me. Relief, shame, and something else. Fear. Grandpa, he whispered. His teeth rattled so hard the word was almost lost. I stripped off my heavy coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. His body shook beneath the fabric, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, years of learning to make himself small, silent, invisible. "How long have you been sitting here?" I asked, steadying him as he tried to rise. His legs nearly gave out. Since this morning," he stammered. The words hit like a hammer. Morning. It was past 3 o'clock. That meant hours in sub-freezing weather. My jaw clenched until it hurt. Why? Why would they leave you outside? His eyes darted toward the door, toward the warm light spilling from the windows. Inside I could hear laughter, the scrape of silverware on china. A feast. "I'm not allowed in," he said softly. Wilbur said, "I ruined the holiday," said I needed to learn responsibility. Wilbur, his stepfather. A fire roared in my chest, hotter than the cold could ever be. Responsibility? For what? Amos lowered his gaze, ashamed. I burned the turkey a little, the skin on top. He said I embarrassed Mom, said guests would think she couldn't cook. So, he locked the door. I looked at the house decorations on the porch, smoke curling from the chimney, golden warmth in every window, and then back at the boy shivering on the steps, like he was nothing more than a stray. This wasn't discipline. This was cruelty, and it was deliberate. I helped him to his feet, guiding him toward my truck. His body leaned against mine, fragile as glass. "Come on," I said. "We're getting you warm." But even as I led him away, I saw more than cold in his posture. I saw the careful way he moved the flinch when my voice sharpened. These weren't the scars of a single bad day. They were the echoes of years. Inside the house, my daughter and her husband carved turkey beneath crystal light. Outside my grandson, my blood was being punished for the color of his skin hidden behind the polite mask of discipline. I could see it now with a clarity that made my stomach twist. Wilbur had never seen Amos as his own. To him, Amos was an outsider, a reminder of difference he could not stand to share a table with. And my daughter, she had let it happen. Snow stung my cheeks as I opened the truck door and settled Amos inside, cranking the heater to full. His hands were too numb to hold the blanket from the emergency kit, so I tucked it around him myself. "You're safe now," I said, though rage churned beneath the words. "You're with me, and I promise you this ends tonight." Through the windshield, the house glowed warm, festive, perfect. But to me it was a prison, a stage where appearances mattered more than humanity. I could hear Martha's voice in my memory. Family is all we have left. And I knew she would never forgive me if I walked away. Not this time. Not when the cost of silence was a boy's life. The heater blasted inside the cab, but Amos still shook under my coat, his hands trembling like brittle twigs. I rubbed warmth back into his fingers, but my mind was already spiraling backward through years of small moments I had dismissed, signs I should have recognized. Last summer on Lake Erie, Amos caught his first base. He held it up with both hands, grinning wide enough to split his face. That joy should have been all I remembered, but there had been the bruise dark along his forearm. I had asked, and he had muttered something about falling off his bike. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe my daughter's new husband wasn't the kind of man who left finger-shaped marks on a boy's skin. I thought of Christmas Eve 2 winters ago. I'd found Amos drowsy-eyed at breakfast, barely able to keep his head up at the table. Later he confessed he'd forgotten to shovel the driveway, so Wilbur made him sleep in the garage as punishment. I'd laughed it off at the time, told him it would build character. Shame settled in my gut now, heavy as stone. Then there were the phone calls, Amos's voice small on the line. Wilbur says I can't eat with them tonight. He says I need to earn it. I had told myself it was just teenage drama, a boy exaggerating. My daughter Leona had waved it away too. Dad, you're overreacting. Wilbur just has high standards. He's teaching Amos discipline. But discipline doesn't leave a child outside to freeze on Thanksgiving. Discipline doesn't lock a boy in the basement for 2 days because of a broken bottle. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. Amos shifted in the seat, glancing toward the glowing house. He always says it's my fault, he whispered, that I don't belong, that Mom only keeps me because she has to. The words twisted like a knife, not just abuse rejection. Rejection sharpened by race. I had heard Wilbur's subtle jabs before, comments about raising someone else's kid, the way he emphasized someone else's with a bitterness that made my skin crawl. I had ignored it, chalked it up to stepfather frustration. But now, staring at Amos's pale lips and shaking hands, I knew better. This wasn't frustration. This was hatred dressed up as authority. I gripped the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles cracked. You listen to me, son. None of this is your fault, not one thing. You hear me? Amos's eyes flicked to mine, wide and uncertain, as if waiting for the world to punish him for daring to hope. I should have seen it sooner, I admitted. My voice trembled, but I forced it steady. I should have come for you years ago. He said nothing, just pulled the blanket tighter, hiding half his face. But his silence wasn't agreement. It was survival. He had learned to keep quiet because quiet meant fewer bruises. Quiet meant maybe he got to stay inside out of the cold. The snow thickened outside, turning the neighborhood into a blur of white. Each glowing window we passed seemed to mock me. Each family gathered around a table that still believed in gratitude and love. I glanced at Amos again. Has this happened before? Him locking you out like this? His jaw tightened. Sometimes. A pause. Last month it was the garage. Before that, the basement. He says if I want to act like a stray, I can live like one. My chest burned. The words weren't just cruel, they carried the stench of something uglier, the kind of prejudice that hides in discipline that turns family dinners into battlefields. I reached out, resting a hand over his. You're not a stray, Amos. You're my grandson, my blood, and you belong. He looked down, blinking fast. For the first time that night, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not hope exactly, but the faintest glimmer that he wasn't alone. The wipers dragged across the windshield, fighting the storm. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, an old man with gray hair and eyes full of rage, finally seeing what had been in front of him for years. This wasn't going to be fixed with quiet conversations or second chances. The signs had been there all along. Bruises, punishments, silences, the way Amos shrank when Wilbur entered a room. And I had ignored them, blind in my hope that family could somehow hold together. But family wasn't supposed to break a boy to pieces. Family was supposed to protect him. I shifted the truck into gear and turned toward the house. Enough pretending, enough silence. It was time to stop ignoring the signs. The cab of my truck was finally warm enough that Amos's trembling began to ease, but his eyes still carried that shadow, the one that told me the cold wasn't the only thing eating at him. I needed to understand what had happened today, every detail. Tell me straight, I said gently, keeping my voice low so he wouldn't flinch. Why did Wilbur lock you out this time? Amos pulled the blanket tighter, his jaw trembling, as if the memory itself was a draft of icy wind. The turkey, he whispered. I frowned. The turkey I was helping Mom in the kitchen, he explained. She asked me to baste it while she showered. I forgot to turn off the oven timer. By the time I checked, the skin on top was burned a little. Not ruined, just darker. His shoulders hunched, as though he expected me to lash out too. Wilbur saw it and said I'd ruined Thanksgiving, said everyone would laugh at Mom. He said I embarrassed the family. I gripped the steering wheel hard, so for that he threw you outside. In the snow. Amos's voice cracked. He said I needed to learn responsibility, that people like me couldn't afford to make mistakes. He made it sound like burning that turkey proved I was worthless. People like me. The words thudded inside my skull. Wilbur hadn't just been punishing carelessness. He'd been feeding that boy the lie that his very existence was a mistake. It wasn't about a turkey. It was about Amos being different, about the color of his skin, reminding Wilbur every day that Amos wasn't his blood. I remembered the first time I heard Wilbur joke about it half a year after marrying Leona. He'd slapped Amos on the shoulder at a cookout, grinning for the neighbors. Doesn't matter how many chores I pile on him, he'll never quite measure up to the rest of us. Everyone laughed politely, like it was harmless humor. I had laughed too, though my stomach had knotted even then. Now, sitting with Amos in my truck, I realized those jokes weren't jokes at all. They were lessons. "Son," I said, forcing calm into my voice. He was wrong. Dead wrong. A burnt turkey doesn't mean a damn thing, and it sure doesn't mean you're worthless. Amos shook his head. "You don't get it. He says it all the time, that I'm lucky to even sit at the table, that I should be grateful he lets me stay under his roof." His eyes flicked toward the house, glowing warm against the snow. "But I'm not allowed to forget. Every mistake, every little thing, I pay for it." The fury inside me threatened to spill over. The image of my grandson shivering outside while Wilbur carved turkey inside was enough to set my hands trembling on the wheel. I thought of Martha, my late wife. She would never have let this stand. She'd been the diplomat, yes, but she was also the fiercest defender of children I'd ever known. I could almost hear her voice in my head. "If you don't step in now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." I turned to Amos, meeting his weary eyes. "You don't have to live like this anymore. Do you understand me? Tonight we put an end to it." But Amos flinched, panic flashing across his face. "No, Grandpa. You don't know him. If you make a scene, he'll take it out on me later. He always does." The words tore at me. This boy had learned that silence was safer than justice, that enduring cruelty was easier than standing up against it. That was the most dangerous lesson of all. I reached for his hand again. "Listen to me. You did nothing wrong. Burning a turkey is not a crime. The crime is what he did to you, locking you outside for hours, humiliating you because you're not his son, because you don't look like him." Amos swallowed hard, his throat bobbing in the glow of the dashboard lights. "What if no one believes me? What if they all think it's just discipline like he says? Then they'll have to answer to me," I said, my voice like iron, "because I believe you, and that's enough to start." We sat in silence for a moment, the snow tapping against the windshield, the heater humming. In that silence, I made my decision. I wasn't leaving Amos to freeze, not tonight, not ever again. The turkey, the excuses, the lies, they all stopped here. I shifted the truck into park, the engine rumbling steady, my eyes fixed on the glowing windows of the house. "Stay warm," I told Amos, though my voice carried steel beneath it. "I'll handle the rest." The boy looked at me with terror and hope warring across his face. But I had already opened the door, stepping back into the storm. The time for excuses was over. The heater hummed on high, filling the cab with a dry warmth that fought against the chill still lodged in Amos's bones. His face was pale, lips, cracked eyes rimmed red from the cold. I kept my coat around his shoulders, but I knew blankets and heat weren't enough. The real frost was buried deeper, carved into him by years of silence. I turned slightly in my seat, forcing my voice steady. "Amos, I need you to tell me everything. Not just today, all of it." At first he stared at the dashboard as if the glowing dials were safer than my eyes. Then his shoulders sagged. "If I tell you, you'll just think I'm weak." "Son," I said, "weakness is when you see the truth and turn away from it. You've been strong for too long carrying this alone. Now it's my turn." The words cracked something open. His voice came out low, almost a whisper, but steady enough to slice through the hum of the engine. He doesn't just yell when I mess up. He controls everything. when I can eat, when I can shower, how long I can stay in the living room. Sometimes he says I talk too much, so he bans me from speaking at dinner. Says I don't deserve the seat at the table. Last Christmas he made me stand in the garage all night because I forgot to shovel the driveway. I clenched my fists against the wheel. The garage, in the middle of December. And Mom, I asked, she just pretends it isn't happening, or says he's teaching me discipline. But discipline doesn't feel like this. His voice cracked. Discipline doesn't make you feel like you're not even family. I swallowed hard, rage rising. He says that Amos nodded. Sometimes, not directly, he'll say things like, "You're lucky we keep you here," or "You're not like the rest of us." When he drinks, it's worse. He says I'll never measure up, that kids like me are trouble, that I should be grateful I get to live under his roof. I didn't have to ask what kids like me meant. The sting of it was clear in every syllable in the way Amos shrank under the weight of those words. It wasn't just punishment. It was prejudice dressed as authority cruelty, wrapped in the language of responsibility. He drew the blanket tighter around him. One time he broke a bottle of beer, said it was my fault because I'd stacked them wrong in the fridge. He locked me in the basement for 2 days. No light, no food except crackers. I thought maybe he'd just leave me there. My breath caught. 2 days. A child left alone in darkness because of a broken bottle. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I already knew. "I tried," he whispered. "Remember when I called you last month, I said Wilbur wouldn't let me eat dinner. You told me not to take it too seriously. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was me." His voice grew quieter. "He makes me believe it's always me." I felt the guilt slam into me heavy and cold. He had reached out and I had brushed it off. All those years I told myself things were fine because it was easier than admitting the truth. "No," I said firmly, gripping his hand. "Don't you dare carry that blame. This isn't you. It was never you." His eyes met mine, searching, desperate for something solid to hold on to. "You belong, Amos," I said, every word steady as steel. "You belong in this family. You belong in this world. And I will not let that man convince you otherwise." For the first time all night, his face softened just slightly. His shoulders eased, as if he'd been holding his breath for 3 years. "Grandpa," he whispered, "if you stand up to him, he'll come after me harder." I looked at the glowing windows of the house, the shadows moving across curtains, laughter leaking into the night. Wilbur thought he'd won. He thought his cruelty was hidden behind wreaths and turkey platters safe from the world. But not tonight. I turned back to Amos, my jaw set. "He's had 3 years to break you down. That ends now. You're not facing him alone anymore." Amos's eyes widened, fear and relief colliding in their depths. "What are you going to do?" I opened the truck door, the wind biting again at my face. My boots crunched in the snow as I stepped out. I looked once more at that house all dressed up in holiday cheer, and I felt the old strength rise in me, the kind forged in factories and long nights with Martha, reminding me that family meant more than blood or rules. "I'm going to make sure he never locks you out again," I said. The door shut behind me, the storm swallowing my words. The wind tore at my coat as I crossed the driveway. Snowflakes stung my face, but the fire in my chest burned hotter than the storm. Each step carried me closer to the house, to the golden glow behind the curtains. From outside, it looked like a picture-perfect Thanksgiving lights, twinkling laughter spilling through the windows, the smell of roasted meat drifting into the night. But outside that perfection, my grandson had nearly frozen to death. I reached the porch and tried the handle. Locked, of course. A symbol of Wilbur's control, warmth, and family kept inside punishment left shivering in the cold. I looked back once. Amos watched from the truck, my coat still around his shoulders, his face pale and fearful. I gave him a nod, meant to say, "I've got this." Then I turned back to the door. 68 years old, my body worn from decades of factory shifts, but anger can give a man strength. I braced, lifted my boot, and drove it into the lock. Wood splintered with a crack that echoed across the quiet street. A second kick sent the door flying open, slamming against the wall. Warmth rushed out, carrying music, the clatter of silverware, the startled gasps of those inside. I stepped across the threshold. The dining room came into view like a painting white tablecloth flickering candles, crystal glasses catching the light. A turkey golden brown and perfect sat in the center. Around the table faces froze in mid-motion. Leona, in a green dress. Wilbur at the head with a carving knife, a little girl lifting her fork. All of them stared at me, at the intruder who had shattered their holiday. But it wasn't me who had broken Thanksgiving. It was the man at the head of the table. "Have you completely lost your minds?" My voice thundered through the room. The little girl dropped her fork. It clattered against her plate. Leona's face went white. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I pointed toward the doorway, toward Amos shivering in my coat. "While you sit here feasting like royalty, that boy was locked outside for 4 hours in freezing weather." 4 hours. Gasps rose around the table. Leona's hand trembled on her wine glass. Wilbur set down the carving knife with deliberate calm. He stood taller and heavier than me, his eyes sharp with anger. "Who gave you permission to enter my house?" His voice was smooth, dangerous. "This is private property. You're trespassing." I stepped forward, planting my feet on the polished wood. "Private property. You mean the prison where you locked my grandson like a stray. You think property gives you the right to abuse a boy because he doesn't look like you?" Wilbur's jaw flexed. His chest puffed as he moved from the table with the swagger of a man used to being feared. "This is my house, my rules." He embarrassed us in front of guests. He needed to learn consequences. I could feel Amos behind me trembling, not from cold this time, but from the terror of confrontation. He had never seen anyone challenge Wilbur in his own domain. "Consequences," I spat the word. "You nearly froze him to death over a turkey skin. That's not discipline. That's abuse." Wilbur's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You wouldn't understand. He's not your responsibility anymore. He's mine. And in my house, adults face adult consequences." There it was, the slip, the truth beneath the polished words. Not discipline, not guidance. Just cruelty, cloaked in authority, sharpened by resentment. Leona's hand shook as she set down her glass. "Dad, please. Don't ruin our holiday. We can discuss this later." I turned on her pain, cutting deeper than rage. "Ruin your holiday? Your son was outside in the snow begging for warmth while you poured wine into crystal glasses. And you're worried about your holiday." Her face crumpled, eyes darting to Wilbur, then to Amos. She said nothing. Wilbur stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "You need to leave, old man. Right now. Before I throw you out myself." I squared my shoulders. "No, not until you apologize to him. Right here. Right now." Silence. The music still played faintly in the background. Some cheery tune about gratitude, but the air was taut, stretched thin. Then Wilbur laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Apologize to him. I don't owe that boy anything. If he doesn't like my rules, he can leave." I leaned in close enough to smell the wine on his breath. My voice dropped hard as stone. "You're right about one thing. He is leaving. With me." The room held its breath. Leona's eyes widened. The little girl whimpered, and Amos shifted uncertainly in the doorway. Wilbur straightened his face dark with fury. "You think you can just walk into my house and take him?" I didn't blink. "Watch me." The Thanksgiving table glittered behind him, untouched plates steaming with food. But all I could see was the boy outside in the snow, the boy this man had tried to break. Family wasn't supposed to feel like a prison. Tonight I was going to prove it. Leona's green dress shimmered faintly in the candlelight as she rose from the table. Her hands trembled, clutching the edge of the cloth, as though it might anchor her in the storm now raging through her home. "Dad," she said, her voice brittle. "Please, don't make this worse." I stared at her, heart aching. "Worse, Leona, your son has frostbite on his lips. He's been sitting in snow for hours while you poured wine into glasses. Tell me, how exactly could it be worse?" Her eyes darted to Wilbur, who loomed beside me, his presence filling the space like a threat. His glare pinned her in place, daring her to speak the truth. She swallowed. Wilbur was just trying to teach him responsibility. "You know how teenagers are, Dad. They exaggerate, they make things sound worse than they are." My gut twisted. That was the excuse I'd heard too many times, the easy dismissal of bruises and silences. Exaggerate. He could have died. Enough! Wilbur snapped, his voice cutting through hers. This is my house, my rules. Amos disrespected us, and he paid the price. That's discipline. Discipline. The word hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Amos, still wrapped in my coat, his eyes fixed on the floor. He'd heard that word so many times it had become a cage around his spirit. Leona, I said softer now, look at your boy. Really look at him. Her gaze flickered reluctantly toward Amos. He shifted, pulling the coat tighter. His shoulders curled inward like he expected a blow. His lips were cracked, his skin mottled with cold. For a moment, I thought I saw at the crack in her armor the flash of recognition. But then Wilbur's hand pressed firmly against her shoulder. His voice dripped with menace, cloaked in calm. Tell him, honey. Tell your father that Amos is overreacting. Tell him this is family discipline. Leona froze, caught between two fires. One fire was the man she had chosen. The man who paid the mortgage, who carried the promise of stability after years of struggling. The other fire was her son, blood of her blood trembling from cold, and years of being made to feel unwanted. Her voice shook. Dad, please, you don't understand. Things are complicated. Complicated, I barked. Complicated is when you can't decide what side dish to serve. This isn't complicated, Leona. This is cruelty. Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept them trained on the floor. If I push too hard, I'll lose everything. The house, the money, the security. And in the process I cut in, you'll lose your son. The words hung heavy. Amos's head jerked up, his eyes wide, as if he hadn't expected anyone to say it out loud. Wilbur's face darkened. That's enough. You have no right to come in here and undermine me. He turned his glare back to Leona. Don't forget who keeps this roof over your head. Don't forget what happens if you cross me. She flinched. I saw it, subtle, small, but undeniable. Fear. The kind that had been trained into her over 3 years of compromise, of silencing her instincts to protect her child in exchange for stability. Leona, I said gently, trying to pierce through the fog of fear. Martha would have told you what I'm telling you now. No roof, no paycheck, no man is worth your child's life. Her lips trembled. I wanted Amos to have a family again. A real family. And what do you call this? I demanded, sweeping my arm toward the table. The glowing candles, the perfect turkey. This isn't family. This is theater. A performance for neighbors and guests while behind the curtains, your son is treated like an outsider in his own home. Wilbur slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the crystal. He is not my son. The words rang through the room like a gunshot. Silence followed, broken only by the faint sob of the little girl at the far end of the table. Leona's face drained of color. She looked at Amos, then back at Wilbur, then at me. The truth had been spoken out loud, and it couldn't be stuffed back into silence. For the first time, Leona whispered something not in defense, not in excuse, but in confession. He treats Amos differently, always has, because... Her voice faltered. Because Amos isn't his blood. Because of who he is. Her words trembled, but they cracked open the facade Wilbur had built. This wasn't just about burnt turkey or chores left undone. It was about identity. It was about race. And Leona had finally named it, even if only in half-broken syllables. Wilbur's eyes blazed. Careful, he growled, low and dangerous. You don't know what you're saying. But she did. For the first time in years, she did. Her hand reached halfway toward Amos, then faltered, but even that tiny gesture made the boy's eyes shimmer with something close to hope. I stepped between them, my voice firm. No more excuses. Tonight, the truth stands in this house. And the truth is that Amos has been abused because he's different, because you decided he would never belong. Wilbur's face twisted rage, spilling past his control. But I no longer cared about his fury. The dam had cracked, the silence was broken, and nothing could make me back down now. The doorbell rang sharp and insistent, cutting through the tension in the dining room. Everyone froze. The little girl stopped mid-sob. Leona wiped at her face, and Wilbur's jaw tightened. The chime came again, followed by heavy knocking. Wilbur sneered. That'll be the police. I called them the moment you stormed in. My chest tightened, but I stood tall. If he thought the law would shield him, he was about to learn otherwise. I opened the door before he could. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their breath rising in clouds, the storm swirling behind them. Their eyes flicked to the splintered wood of the doorframe, then back to me. "Sir," the lead officer said evenly, "we've had a report of a break-in and possible kidnapping." "Are you Mr. Burke?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And there's been no kidnapping. I brought my grandson inside after finding him locked out in freezing weather for 4 hours." Behind me, Wilbur stepped forward quickly, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "He's lying. That boy belongs in my house. This man broke in and dragged him away. He's been trying to poison my family against me since day one." The second officer glanced past us, spotting Amos in the hallway, wrapped in my coat, shivering, his lips still tinged blue. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Son, is this true? Did your grandfather force you to leave?" Amos's voice trembled, but he forced it out. "No, sir. He saved me. I was outside since morning, locked out." Wilbur barked a bitter laugh. "Oh, come on. He exaggerates everything. It was maybe an hour and he was dressed warmly. He was in a t-shirt," I snapped. "In 20-degree weather. When I arrived, he could barely stand." The lead officer shifted, clearly uneasy. He had seen enough neglect to recognize the signs. Still, protocol demanded neutrality. "Let's move this inside. We need to sort this out calmly." They stepped into the dining room, their boots dripping snow onto the hardwood. The atmosphere was brittle, like glass under pressure. "Let's start from the beginning," the officer said, pulling out a notepad. "Mr. Green, you're the stepfather." "Correct?" Wilbur straightened, putting on his best performance of calm authority. "Yes. I was disciplining Amos after he ruined Thanksgiving dinner. Teenagers need consequences. His mother and I agreed. I didn't agree," Leona blurted suddenly, her voice cracking. She stared at the floor, but the words were out. The officers turned to her. "What exactly happened, ma'am?" Her hands twisted in front of her. "Amos burned the turkey. Wilbur got angry. He said Amos needed to sit outside until he learned responsibility. He locked the door, told me not to let him in." The silence after her words was heavier than any storm. Wilbur's face turned white, then flushed red. "Leona," he hissed, "what are you doing?" The officer fixed him with a steady look. "Sir, is that true?" "You intentionally left an 18-year-old outside in freezing conditions," Wilbur sputtered. "It wasn't that bad. He could have come in any time if he apologized." "No, he couldn't," Leona said louder this time. Tears streaked her cheeks. "You told me not to let him in no matter what." For a moment, the whole room shifted. The balance of power tilted away from Wilbur, his mask cracked rage boiling just beneath his skin. The officer scribbled notes, his jaw set. "This isn't discipline. This is endangerment, especially given the weather conditions." Wilbur stepped forward, trying to loom over them. "This is a private family matter. You have no business here." The second officer's voice was sharp. "We have every business when a minor or anyone is put at risk of hypothermia. You're lucky this boy's still alive." I put a hand on Amos's shoulder, steadying him. He leaned into me, trembling, but this time not from the cold. This was fear giving way just barely to something else, the chance of being believed. Wilbur's voice rose desperate now. "He's not even my blood. Why should I be blamed for trying to make him better?" The words hung in the air like poison. Everyone heard the truth in them. This wasn't about discipline. It was about difference. About not wanting Amos at his table and his family under his roof because Amos didn't look like him. The officers exchanged a look. One nodded slightly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we continue this conversation." Wilbur's eyes blazed with fury, but for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look invincible. He looked cornered, and for the first time in years, Amos looked like maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally on his side. The dining room felt like a courtroom. The officer stood near the doorway, pens ready, eyes sharp. Wilbur paced like a caged animal, fists clenching and unclenching. Leona hovered at the edge of the table, her hands trembling, torn between silence and truth. Amos sat close to me, my coat still wrapped around him, his face pale but his gaze steady on the floor. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we need your account of what happened today. Please speak plainly." Leona's lips parted, but no sound came. She glanced at Wilbur. His stare bore into her warning, commanding. Years of intimidation weighed on her shoulders. "Leona," I said softly, cutting through the thick silence, "look at Amos." Her eyes flicked to her son. His thin frame, the bruises faint along his jaw, the way he held himself as if afraid to take up space. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting tears. "Mrs. Green," the officer said gently, "what really happened?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "He locked Amos outside. Since 11 this morning." Wilbur's head snapped toward her. "Don't you dare! Sir, step back!" the second officer ordered, moving between them. Leona's shoulders shook, but she pressed on. It wasn't the first time. He's made Amos sleep in the garage in the basement. Sometimes he doesn't let him eat dinner. He controls everything. Her words tumbled out faster now, years of silence breaking apart. He says Amos isn't his son, that he'll never be like the rest of us, that he doesn't belong. The room went still. Amos lifted his head slowly, disbelief flickering in his eyes. For the first time, his mother wasn't hiding behind excuses. She was saying it aloud. Wilbur's face twisted with rage. "Leona, shut your mouth. You don't know what you're doing." But her voice grew stronger. "Yes, I do. I've let this go on too long. I told myself it was discipline, that it was normal. But it isn't. It's abuse. And it's because of who Amos is." Her words rang like a gavel, final and undeniable. The late officer closed his notepad with a snap. "That's enough. Sir, turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for child endangerment and abuse." Wilbur's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't do this. He's 18. He's an adult." 18 doesn't change what you did," the officer said calmly. "You left him outside in sub-freezing weather for 4 hours. That's criminal negligence." Wilbur lunged toward Leona, but the second officer blocked him, twisting his arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. He snarled over his shoulder, eyes locked on her. "You'll regret this. You'll lose everything without me. The house, the money, you'll be nothing." Tears streaked her cheeks, but her chin lifted. "I'd rather have nothing than lose my son." The officers marched him toward the door. The holiday music still played softly in the background, absurdly cheerful, as the front door shut behind them. Silence followed, heavy and raw. Leona sank into a chair, sobs shaking her shoulders. Years of buried pain spilled out at once. Amos hesitated, then moved to her side. His voice cracked. "Mom." She reached for him with trembling hands. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have been stronger." Amos's face softened, though the hurt lingered in his eyes. "You were strong tonight." I felt my chest tighten. For 3 years, that boy had been made to believe he was weak, unwanted lesser. Tonight, the silence had shattered. The truth was out. I looked at Amos kneeling beside his mother and saw something flicker in his expression. A spark of hope, faint but real. The storm raged outside, but inside the house the air had changed. For the first time in years, Amos wasn't invisible. He was seen. The drive back to my house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm, not peace exactly, but exhaustion. Amos sat beside me, staring out the window at the blur of snow and streetlights. My coat still wrapped around his shoulders, though the truck heater had long since chased away the chill. I glanced at him now and then, but I didn't push. After years of being silenced, he deserved to decide when and how to speak. When we pulled into my driveway, the porch light glowed like a small beacon. The house itself was modest, a single-story ranch with worn siding and a sagging gutter Martha had always said we should fix. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was safe. "Home, sweet home," I said quietly, shutting off the engine. Amos looked at the little house as if it were a castle. His breath caught. "It's warm," he whispered, as though the word itself was a miracle. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender from the sachets Martha used to tuck into drawers. I flipped on the lights, casting a gentle glow across the familiar furniture. The old recliner sagged in the corner, the carpet worn from decades of footsteps, but every detail carried comfort. "Come on," I said. "I'll show you your room." We walked down the hallway to the guest room, the one Martha had decorated with her favorite quilt patches of blue, green, and yellow, stitched into a pattern she said looked like sunlight on water. The dresser still held a few of Amos's old things from past visits, a stack of comics, a photo of him holding up a fishing rod with a smile wide enough to light the sky. He froze in the doorway, staring at it all. This was always my room," he murmured. "And it still is," I said. "No one can take that from you." He set his duffel bag on the bed, then pressed a hand against the quilt, as if testing whether it was real. For the first time in hours, maybe in years, his shoulders eased. "You hungry?" I asked. He nodded hesitantly. In the kitchen, I pulled chicken from the freezer and vegetables from the fridge. Nothing fancy, but a hot meal all the same. Amos helped without me asking, washing carrots, chopping onions with a concentration that bordered on reverence. He moved cautiously, as if afraid I might scold him for doing it wrong. "You don't have to earn your dinner here," I told him. "This is your home, not a job." He looked down, his hands pausing on the cutting board. Then slowly he nodded. We ate by the fire plates balanced on our knees. The flames crackled, throwing shadows across the room. Amos sat close, soaking in the warmth, his eyes fixed on the fire as if memorizing it. "Tell me about school," I said gently. His voice was quiet, but steadier now. "I made the dean's list last semester. I want to study mechanical engineering. Like you used to work at the factory." I smiled. "Like grandfather, like grandson." His eyes lit for a moment, pride pushing back the shadows. "Grandpa," he whispered, "I thought I'd never get out of there, that I'd never belong anywhere. But it feels real." I set down my plate and put a hand on his shoulder. "It is real. You're safe now. You belong here." For the first time, Amos leaned into me without hesitation. The boy who had flinched at every raised voice, every sharp movement, allowed himself to rest. That night, after he settled into the guest room, I stood in the hallway listening to the even rhythm of his breathing. Martha's quilt was pulled up to his chin, the comics stacked neatly on the nightstand. He looked like any 18-year-old should, safe, warm, at peace. I whispered into the quiet, "You're home, son." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, turning the frost on the glass into tiny stars. Amos sat at the table in one of my old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled high on his arms. He looked younger in that light, still weary, but not broken. I set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Eat up. College boys need their fuel." His fork hovered midair. "You really think I can still go?" "You're damn right," I said. "Your future isn't over because of what happened. It's just beginning." For the first time, a small smile tugged at his lips. That week I made calls to the college, to his counselor, to anyone who would listen. I explained what had happened, careful but honest, pushing past the shame that had kept it hidden. The counselor's voice was steady. "He's not the first. We'll help him get through this." Amos started meeting with a school advisor who connected him to a scholarship program. They didn't just look at grades, they looked at resilience, and Amos had that in spades. But it wasn't only the school. Word spread quietly through the community. At church, an old friend of Martha's pulled me aside, pressing an envelope into my hand. "For his books," she whispered. The local library where Leona found part-time work offered him tutoring shifts, giving him both experience and a paycheck. Even neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years began dropping off casseroles and warm jackets. Still, there was tension. Some whispered that I'd overstepped, that Wilbur was strict, but not cruel, that families had a right to their own rules. But when Amos stood up at a youth group meeting and spoke, his voice shaking at first, then steady about what it meant to be locked out in the cold because of who he was, the room went silent. No one dared call it discipline again. He made friends who saw him not as a burden, but as a fighter. A boy named Jake, a wiry kid with a guitar, and a laugh that came easy, became his closest ally. They practiced in the library basement, their music leaking through the vents like a promise of better days. At night, Amos and I would sit by the fire, and he would tell me pieces of what he carried, the words Wilbur had thrown like stones, the feeling of being less than in his own home, the way silence had seemed safer than truth. Each time I reminded him, "You're not less. You never were." Slowly, the shadows in his eyes began to lift. One evening, after finishing a long scholarship essay, he looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, I want to do more than just get out. I want to help other kids like me, kids who get told they don't belong." I saw Martha in that moment, in his fire, his determination. She'd always said pain could be turned into purpose if you were brave enough. The community was beginning to see Amos not as a victim, but as a survivor. And Amos was beginning to see himself that way too. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a new resolve in our family. Leona moved more carefully now, like a woman who had been walking on glass for years and finally dared to step on solid ground. She filed for divorce, a thick stack of paperwork that shook in her hands, but carried a quiet defiance Wilbur had never managed to crush. I drove her to the courthouse on the morning she signed the petition. Amos sat in the back seat, his gaze steady on the road ahead. None of us spoke much, but there was a shared current fear, yes, but also relief. When she walked out afterward, she didn't look defeated. She looked lighter, like a chain had been cut from her neck. "It's just paperwork," she whispered, but her voice carried something harder than paper. It carried freedom. The weeks that followed were not easy. Wilbur fought. He sent letters through his lawyer, cold and venomous, accusing Leona of betrayal me, of meddling Amos, of being ungrateful. He threatened to take the house, the car, the little stability she had left. But Leona didn't bend. For the first time in years, she refused to look down. She found a job at the library part-time but steady, and she started attending counseling sessions the court recommended. Each time she came home afterward, her shoulders stood a little straighter. Amos noticed. "She's different," he told me one night as we worked in the garden. "She's braver." "She always was. I said planting seeds in the soil Martha once tended. She just needed permission to see it." The court granted a protective order limiting Wilbur's contact. When he showed up once red-faced and shouting from the street, the police came fast. For once, authority stood on the right side of the line. Amos flinched at the siren's old fears rising, but I put a hand on his shoulder. "He can't hurt you anymore." Little by little, Wilbur's presence shrank from our lives. His threats lost their teeth. His voice became a memory instead of a shadow hanging over every meal. And with his absence, something else bloomed space. Space for Amos to laugh without fear, for Leona to breathe without bracing for the next command for our home to sound like a family again. One evening, Amos sat at the table, papers spread around him, scholarship forms, class schedules, letters from advisors. He looked up, eyes shining with determination. "I'm going to Ohio State," he said. Leona gasped softly. I grinned so wide my face hurt. He tapped the letter with his finger. "Full scholarship. They saw something in me even when I didn't." His voice steadied. "I want to use it, not just for me, for kids like me. I want to make sure no one has to sit outside and wonder if they belong." Leona reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You've always belonged," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just wish I'd said it sooner." Amos smiled at her, soft, forgiving, but strong. Stronger than any chain Wilbur had ever wrapped around him. That night, as I turned out the lights and checked the locks, I realized the house felt different. Not larger, not cleaner, but alive again. It hummed with something Wilbur had never understood. It hummed with freedom. Freedom didn't erase the past. It only gave it space to breathe. In the months after Wilbur's arrest and the divorce, Amos carried himself differently. Shoulders no longer curled inward, his voice steadier when he spoke. But sometimes in the quiet of the evening, the old shadows returned. I'd find him staring out the window at night, hands clenched into fists, eyes distant. Once I heard him whisper, "What if he comes back?" The fear wasn't logical. Wilbur was bound by law now, but trauma isn't logical. It seeps into the bones, makes you jump at doors slamming or footsteps on stairs. At school, Amos excelled. His grades rose even higher, his scholarship secured, but still there were moments. A teacher raised his voice over a late assignment, and Amos froze his chest, tightening until he couldn't breathe. A group of boys joked about people who can't handle responsibility, and Amos walked away, but his jaw stayed tight the whole evening. He began therapy through the college's counseling program. At first he hated it. "I'm not broken," he told me. "You're not," I said. "But healing doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've been hurt and you deserve care." Over time, the sessions helped. He began naming things he had never dared to name: neglect, emotional abuse, racism woven into punishment. Naming them took away some of their power. Leona wrestled with her own demons. Nights she'd cry quietly in her room, guilt thick as smoke around her. "I let him hurt my boy," she said once, her voice breaking. "I thought keeping the house the stability was worth it. But it wasn't. Nothing was. Don't drown in regret," I told her. "You chose differently when it mattered most. That's what counts." Still, the echoes of Wilbur's cruelty reached beyond our walls. Some neighbors whispered that Amos had exaggerated. A woman at church muttered that kids these days just call everything abuse. Amos heard those words even when they weren't said to his face. He carried them like fresh bruises. But he also carried something else: resilience. One evening, after returning from a youth support group, he sat by the fire with me. "Grandpa," he said slowly, "I used to think I was the problem, that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, he'd accept me. But now I know. Nothing I did would have been enough. It was never about me. It was about him." I felt a lump in my throat. "That's the truth, son. It was never about you." He leaned back, staring at the firelight. "Then maybe it's time I stop carrying his voice in my head. Maybe it's time I start listening to my own." For the first time in years, Amos's words didn't sound like survival. They sounded like healing. Spring rolled in with soft rains and green shoots pressing through the soil Martha once tended. Amos spent afternoons at the library tutoring younger students' evenings, bent over textbooks or strumming a borrowed guitar with Jake. The boy who once flinched at every loud voice was beginning to stand taller. One night he came into the living room clutching a notebook. His hands trembled, but his eyes carried a fire. "Grandpa," he said, "I wrote something for the school paper." I set aside my crossword. "Read it to me." He took a deep breath and began. His words weren't polished, but they carried weight. He wrote about what it meant to feel invisible at your own table, about the cruelty hidden behind words like discipline and responsibility. He wrote about the difference between guidance and control, about how prejudice can live inside a house dressed with wreaths and candles. By the time he finished, my throat was tight. "Amos," I said, "that's not just an essay, that's your truth, and the world needs to hear it." He published it the next week. Some students whispered. A few teachers avoided his eyes. But others, kids who'd felt silenced in their own homes, kids who carried bruises of a different kind, came up to him quietly, thanking him for putting into words what they had never dared to say. Encouraged, Amos and Jake started a small group on campus, a circle where students could talk openly about family struggles, about prejudice and silence, about finding their worth again. They called it the Belonging Project. I went to one of their meetings sitting quietly in the back, while a dozen young people shared pieces of themselves. A girl with glasses admitted she was never allowed to speak at dinner unless called on. A boy with a cast on his arm confessed he didn't fall off his bike like he'd told everyone. Each story chipped away at isolation, replacing it with something stronger: community. Amos spoke last. His voice was steady now. "We can't change the families we were born into, but we can build new ones, families that protect, that listen, that remind us we belong. None of us are mistakes. None of us are less." The room filled with quiet nods, with tears, with a sense that maybe healing was possible. Walking home afterward, Amos looked up at the stars. For so long I thought silence kept me safe, but speaking, it's what's saving me. I put my arm around his shoulders. Martha would be proud. For the first time, Amos smiled without hesitation. And I realized he wasn't just finding his voice. He was becoming a voice for himself and for others still waiting in the cold. By summer, Amos had grown into a young man I barely recognized, not because his face had changed, but because the weight on it had lifted. His shoulders no longer slumped under invisible chains. He carried himself with a confidence earned, not given. One afternoon he came home holding a flyer. "There's going to be a community forum at the town hall," he said. "They want people to speak about family, youth, and safety. Jake thinks I should share my story." I studied his face. He wasn't asking if he could. He was deciding if he should. "You don't owe anyone your pain," I told him. "But if you choose to share it, might give someone else courage." He nodded slowly. "That's what I keep thinking." The night of the forum, the town hall buzzed with neighbors, teachers, church leaders, even the mayor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and folding chairs. On stage, speakers took turns, a teacher discussing after-school programs, a coach talking about mentorship, a social worker urging better resources. Then Amos's name was called. He stepped to the podium, papers trembling in his hand. At first his voice wavered. "My name is Amos Green. Some of you know me, some of you don't, but most of you probably think you know my family." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "I want to tell you what family looked like for me," he continued. Family was being told I didn't belong. Family was being locked in basements, garages, porches, while everyone else sat inside, warm and laughing. Family was being told I should be grateful to even be allowed in the house. His voice steadied. That wasn't discipline. That was abuse. And it was made worse because of who I am, because I didn't look like the man who punished me. The room fell silent. Even those who had whispered doubts before now sat frozen. Amos leaned closer to the microphone. But I survived. Because someone came for me, because someone believed me, and because I finally found the courage to speak. He spoke of resilience, of the need for safe spaces, of how prejudice can live inside homes that look perfect from the outside. He challenged the community to listen when children whispered that something was wrong, to believe them before it was too late. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, not polite, not hesitant, but thunderous. People rose to their feet. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Afterwards, strangers approached him. A teacher clasped his hand. A mother hugged him tightly, whispering that her own son needed to hear his words. The mayor promised to expand funding for youth counseling programs. Driving home, Amos sat in the passenger seat silent, staring out the window. Finally, he said, "I was so scared. But when I spoke, it felt like chains breaking." I smiled, my chest swelling with pride. That's because they did. That night, as we sat on the porch under the stars, I realized something. Amos hadn't just survived. He had transformed. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a lantern in the dark, lighting the way for others. 1 year later, Thanksgiving looked nothing like the one that nearly broke us. The table in my modest dining room was covered with Martha's old quilt, repurposed as a tablecloth. The dishes were mismatched, the glasses simple, but the room glowed with warmth. Leona bustled in the kitchen, flipping biscuits in the oven, while humming a tune I hadn't heard from her in years. Amos sat at the table, shoulders broad now, confidence written in the way he leaned back in his chair. He wore his Ohio State sweatshirt, proudly a letter from the scholarship committee pinned to the fridge like a badge of honor. When he caught me looking, he grinned. "Don't worry, Grandpa. I didn't burn the turkey." We laughed, the sound easy, unbroken by fear. As we ate, Amos talked about his classes, mechanical engineering, but also social work electives. He told us about the Belonging Project, the student group he and Jake had started. It had grown to 30 members, kids from every background, each carrying scars but finding strength together. "I want to design machines," Amos said, between bites of mashed potatoes. "But I also want to design spaces where kids feel safe. Maybe one day I'll start a nonprofit. Help others the way you helped me." Leona's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from guilt. They were from pride. "You're changing the story," she whispered. Later, we cleared the table together, laughter filling the kitchen. No crystal glasses, no polished facade, just us, free and whole. After dinner, we sat by the fire. Amos strummed his guitar softly, a song he'd written himself. His voice carried through the house, steady and sure. When he finished, he looked at me. "Grandpa, thank you. For seeing me. For coming for me when no one else did." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I should have come sooner. "You came when it mattered," he said simply. I leaned back, the crackle of the fire warming the room. Through the window, snow fell gently, not as a threat this time, but as a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, Thanksgiving felt true, not about perfection, but about presence. Not about appearances, but about love. Family wasn't a prison anymore. It was freedom. And as Amos laughed with his mother strumming chords that carried into the night, I knew Martha would have been proud. Proud of him, proud of us, proud that from the coldest winter we had carved out a new kind of warmth, the kind that lasts,